A cry in the dark. Officer Tom Hayes strolled down the sun-dappled sidewalk, his dark blue uniform crisp under the warm afternoon light. It was one of those rare, tranquil days in the neighborhood he patrolled, where everything seemed in harmony. The chirping of birds was faint in the background. The sound of children's laughter echoed from nearby homes, and a slight breeze stirred the leaves of the trees that lined the streets. There was a subtle joy in the world on days like these. For Tom, it was a reminder of how much he appreciated these quiet moments, especially given the nature of his work. As he moved forward, Tom couldn't help but take in the peaceful atmosphere. He enjoyed the predictability of his daily routine. Walking his beat was something he had grown to love over the years. The people in the neighborhood were familiar, kind, and always willing to offer a friendly wave or a smile as he passed by. He'd spent countless hours walking these streets, learning the rhythm of life in this community, and it had become a part of him. But as he neared the end of his shift and began to turn into a narrow alley, something shifted in the air. It was subtle at first, but a sound reached his ears, something that didn't belong. It was a faint, fragile cry. A baby's cry, distinct in its desperation. Tom's heart jolted at the sound. Instinctively, his pace quickened as he turned his head in the direction of the cry. His eyes darted down the alley, scanning for the source. The alley was narrow, shaded by high brick walls and overgrown vines that cast long shadows. It wasn't a place anyone would expect to hear the sound of a helpless infant. It was too quiet, too eerie, too hidden. The cry came again, softer now, but unmistakable. Tom's breath caught in his throat as a sense of urgency rushed over him. It wasn't just a random noise. It was a cry for help. A cry that pierced through the calm like a siren in the night. Every instinct he had told him he needed to act, and fast. His heart thudding in his chest, Tom moved quickly through the alley, his eyes scanning the ground and the corners of the space for any sign of where the sound was coming from. His mind raced, a mix of confusion and dread clouding his thoughts. What was a baby doing here, in an alley, alone? The sound of the baby's cries grew louder as Tom continued to move forward, his pulse quickening. As he approached a large metal trash can, partially obscured by the overgrown weeds and discarded debris, the cry became almost unbearable. He stopped in his tracks, frozen by the intensity of it. For a split second, he considered the possibility that the baby might be trapped under something, or worse, in immediate danger. Tom's stomach turned as he moved toward the trash can, his hands trembling with both concern and disbelief. How could someone leave a helpless child like this, abandoned in the most desolate place imaginable? His eyes locked onto the rusted lid of the trash can, the source of the noise. With a mix of reluctance and determination, he bent down, his fingers gripping the edge of the metal lid. A wave of sickeningly foul air hit him as he lifted it, the smell of rotting food and decay overwhelming his senses. But beneath that putrid scent, there was something else, something that broke Tom's heart in an instant. There, nestled among the discarded trash, was a tiny black baby boy. His face was scrunched up in distress, his tiny fists waving in the air, helpless and frightened. His skin was a deep shade of brown, and his dark eyes shimmered with confusion and fear. The boy was so small, barely clothed, and his body was covered in dirt, as if he'd been left there for hours, maybe even longer. Tom's heart sank, and an overwhelming wave of protectiveness washed over him. His mind raced as he realized what he was seeing. The baby had been abandoned, left to fend for himself in a garbage bin with no regard for his well-being. It was a brutal reality that Tom wasn't sure he could ever come to terms with. The innocence in the child's eyes tore through him, and he felt an immediate need to protect him, to give him a chance at something better. Without a second thought, Tom gently scooped the baby up from the trash, cradling him in his arms as if he were the most precious thing in the world. His breath caught in his throat as he felt the baby's tiny body press against his chest. He could feel the warmth of the infant, the softness of his skin, and the faint heartbeat that told him this child was alive. Barely, but alive. There, little one," Tom whispered softly, his voice barely above a murmur as he rocked the child gently in his arms. "You're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you." The baby's cries subsided, replaced by soft whimpers, as he snuggled into Tom's chest, seeking comfort and security. Tom could feel the tears welling up in his eyes. How could anyone do something so heartless? How could someone abandon a child so helpless, so innocent? As he held the baby close, a flood of memories washed over him. He thought of his own children, their faces, their laughter, the warmth of their love. They had always been surrounded by so much care and protection, so much joy. He couldn't imagine a world where a child like this didn't have those things. He couldn't fathom how any parent could bring themselves to do something so cruel. The baby, still trembling in his arms, had a faint scent of dirt and fear, but Tom's protective instincts kicked in as he held him close. His mind raced as he thought of the next steps. The first priority was getting the baby to safety. There was no time to waste. He needed to make sure the child was okay, that he would be cared for properly. Tom looked around the alley, the silence now feeling heavier than before. There were no signs of anyone, no clues, no evidence of who had left the baby there or why. Tom's eyes searched the surrounding area, hoping for a glimpse of someone who might explain this tragedy, but there was nothing. Just the faintest rustling of the wind and the distant sounds of the neighborhood beyond the alley. He couldn't stay here. The baby needed help, and fast. With a steadying breath, Tom began walking back toward the main road. His mind focused on one thing: getting the baby to safety. As he moved, he cradled the infant more carefully, feeling the boy's tiny fingers grip his uniform, a silent sign of trust. Tom couldn't help but think that this was a moment that would forever change his life. By the time Tom reached his patrol car, his thoughts were a whirlwind. He couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense of responsibility he felt toward this child. Whoever had abandoned the baby had taken something from him, something that could never be replaced, and Tom was determined to give him a chance at the life he deserved. He carefully placed the baby in the backseat of his patrol car, fastening him securely in place with the seatbelt. Tom closed the door softly, his heart pounding as he climbed into the front seat. He turned on the engine, the familiar hum of the car's engine offering him a sense of comfort in the midst of the storm of emotions swirling inside him. As he drove toward the hospital, Tom's thoughts were consumed with questions. Who had left this child to die in the trash? What secrets did his past hold? And most pressing of all, who would this baby grow up to be? In the silence of the car, the baby's breathing was steady, a small but reassuring sound. Tom's mind remained focused, but his heart was heavy. There was so much to figure out, so many unknowns, but one thing was certain. He would be there for this child, no matter what. He would protect him, no matter the cost. And so, as the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the horizon, Tom Hayes made a promise to the tiny life in the backseat of his car. He would give this child a chance. Chance at love, safety, and a future far brighter than the darkness of the trash can from which he had been pulled. "You're not alone anymore," Tom whispered into the quiet of the car, his voice filled with resolve. "You're going to be okay." The beginning of a new life. The hospital lights flickered overhead as Officer Tom Hayes strode through the automatic doors, the baby still cradled gently in his arms. His mind raced, trying to come to terms with everything that had happened in the last few hours. He had always been a protector, a man who believed in justice and righting wrongs, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the devastation of finding a tiny, helpless child abandoned in a trash can. As Tom approached the front desk, the nurse behind the counter looked up from her paperwork. Her gaze immediately shifted to the baby in Tom's arms, her face softening as she saw the fragile infant. "Officer, what do we have here?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Tom's throat tightened as he looked down at the child, the tears that had welled up earlier now threatening to spill over. He fought them back with all the strength he had. "I found him in a trash can. Abandoned. I'm not sure how long he's been there, but he needs help. The nurse's expression changed, her professional demeanor instantly taking over as she moved from behind the counter. She walked toward Tom with a clipboard ready to take charge. "We'll get him checked out right away," she said as she gently placed a hand on the baby's tiny arm, coaxing Tom to follow her. Tom nodded and followed the nurse down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways. His mind drifted back to the moment when he had lifted the baby from the trash. The child had been so small, so vulnerable. His face had been streaked with dirt, his tiny body trembling from the cold, and his cries had been a mixture of fear and hunger. It was impossible to believe that someone had been capable of abandoning him in such a brutal way. The nurse led Tom into a private examination room where a pediatrician was waiting, already preparing for the baby's arrival. Tom gently placed the infant on the padded examination table, the warmth of the room a stark contrast to the chill of the alley. The pediatrician, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, moved quickly but with gentle hands, assessing the baby's condition. "Let's check him over," she murmured as she carefully removed the baby's torn and dirtied clothes. Tom watched from the side, his eyes never leaving the fragile child. The pediatrician quickly ran a stethoscope over the baby's chest, checking for any signs of respiratory distress. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice calm and reassuring. "He's lucky to be alive. His heart and lungs sound good, but he's underweight for his age. He's probably been without food for some time. We'll need to hydrate him and get him on a proper feeding schedule." Tom's chest tightened at the words. "How long do you think he's been out there?" The pediatrician paused for a moment, considering. "Hard to say. Babies can survive for a while without food, but he's definitely been through an ordeal. The important thing is that he's here now, and we'll take care of him." Tom nodded, his gaze never leaving the baby. He couldn't help but feel a deep connection to the child, a bond that was instant and unshakable. Despite the tragedy that had brought them together, Tom knew that this little boy had somehow become a part of his life. After the examination, the pediatrician moved to the baby's side to begin administering an IV for hydration. "We'll keep him here for a few days for observation," she explained as she worked. "But given the circumstances, we'll need to contact child services. We'll also need to run a few tests to determine if there's anything else we need to be concerned about." Tom felt a knot form in his stomach at the mention of child services. He had always been a firm believer in protecting children, but the idea of the baby being placed into the system, not knowing where he would end up, was a frightening thought. "I can take care of him," Tom said, the words tumbling out before he even realized it. "I can provide for him. I'll make sure he's safe." The pediatrician glanced up at him, her expression soft but firm. "I understand your concern, Officer Hayes, but you know as well as I do that there are legal procedures we must follow. It's not up to us to decide where he goes." Tom felt his heart sink. The baby was now in the system, and he didn't know how long it would take before he was placed somewhere else, somewhere far from him. The thought of losing this child, of him being passed from one stranger to another, was unbearable. He glanced at the baby again, the tiny chest rising and falling with each breath, the faint sound of his heartbeat a lifeline. He had been through so much already, but there was a flicker of hope now. A new life was beginning here, and Tom would do everything in his power to make sure it was a life worth living. "I understand," Tom said, his voice quieter now. "But I'll do whatever I can to help him, whatever he needs." The pediatrician nodded, her eyes sympathetic. "I'm sure you will. Let's get him settled, and we'll keep you updated on his condition." As the nurse and pediatrician continued their work, Tom stepped back into the hallway, his mind still swirling with thoughts of the baby. He had never imagined that something like this could happen, finding an abandoned child, a child who had been left behind in a world that could be so cruel. Yet here he was, with this tiny life in his hands, and he couldn't turn away. He couldn't leave him to face a future without someone to care for him. Tom made his way to a nearby waiting area and sat down, his heart heavy but determined. He wasn't sure what the next steps would be, but he knew he had to act quickly. Time was of the essence. The baby needed more than just medical care. He needed stability, love, and a sense of belonging. And if there was any chance that Tom could provide that, he would do whatever it took. For the next several hours, Tom waited patiently, checking in with the medical staff regularly. He spoke to social workers, trying to understand what the process would be for the baby's future. All the while, his mind kept returning to the question that plagued him. Why had someone done this to the child? What had driven them to abandon him, to leave him to fend for himself in such a cruel and heartless way? As the evening wore on, Tom found himself alone in the quiet hospital room with the baby, who was now peacefully sleeping after being fed and hydrated. The small, fragile child lay in the hospital crib, wrapped in a soft blanket, his tiny chest rising and falling with each gentle breath. Tom stood by the crib, watching the baby closely, his heart swelling with a protective love that he had never expected to feel. The boy had no name, no past, no identity, at least not yet. But Tom vowed to change that. He would find out who this child was, where he came from, and why he had been abandoned. He wouldn't let the boy's story end in tragedy. There was so much left to be discovered, so much left to do. And as Tom stood there, watching over the child, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, and there would be moments of doubt and uncertainty. But no matter what came next, Tom would be there for him. This baby would have a future, and Tom would make sure it was a future worth living. As he turned off the light and settled into a chair beside the crib, Tom whispered softly into the quiet of the room, his voice filled with the weight of his promise. "You're not alone anymore. I'll protect you. I'll make sure you know you're loved." Secrets beneath the surface. Days turned into weeks, and still, the baby remained in Tom's care. After the initial medical treatment and a few days of observation, the child, who had been given the name Ethan by the hospital staff, seemed to stabilize. His health improved steadily, though he was still fragile, small for his age, and in need of extra care and attention. But the bond between him and Tom had already solidified, a connection forged in the fire of tragedy and necessity. Tom spent his days at the hospital, visiting Ethan every chance he could. He would sit by the baby's side, talking to him softly, even when the infant could only respond with curious eyes or a soft gurgle. The hospital staff, many of whom had witnessed his devotion, often remarked on how well he was caring for Ethan. To them, it seemed almost as if Ethan had found a new father, someone who would protect him with everything he had. However, the social workers and medical team were clear with Tom. Ethan could not stay with him indefinitely without going through the proper channels. Child Services had already been notified, and an official investigation into Ethan's background was underway. The complexity of his situation loomed over Tom like a dark cloud, and though he knew he had no legal claim to Ethan, he refused to let go without a fight. One day, as Tom sat with Ethan in his arms, the nurse approached him, her expression serious. "Officer Hayes, we need to talk." "There's something you should know," she said quietly, leading him into a corner of the hospital room where they wouldn't be overheard. Tom's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" The nurse hesitated for a moment before speaking. "We've run some additional tests on Ethan as part of the investigation. It turns out that he's been on the radar of Child Services before, but we couldn't find any documentation about him until now." Tom frowned. "What do you mean? He's just a baby. How could he have been in the system already?" The nurse sighed and rubbed the back of her neck, as though unsure of how much she should reveal. "It's not what you think. It's not like he was in foster care or anything like that. The thing is, there are some records, some sealed files, and the people who are trying to get custody of him, they're not just any ordinary caseworkers." Tom's brow furrowed in confusion. "Who are they?" The nurse glanced around the room, ensuring no one else was listening. "I don't know all the details, but there's something strange about the whole situation. From what I understand, the people trying to claim him aren't regular social workers. They seem to be part of something else, something that goes beyond child services. Tom's stomach dropped. He had seen his fair share of complicated cases in his time as a police officer, but this was beginning to feel like something far darker. There was more to Ethan's story than anyone could have imagined, and whatever secrets lay hidden in his past were about to come to light. "What do you think it means?" Tom asked, his voice low. The nurse's eyes shifted nervously. "I don't know, but you should be careful. There's more going on here than anyone is saying." Tom left the hospital that day with a heavy heart. He didn't want to believe that there could be any sinister forces involved with Ethan's past, but he couldn't ignore the feeling of dread creeping into his thoughts. There was a part of him that feared Ethan's history was far more complicated and dangerous than just a tragic abandonment. Something about this child, this situation, was off, and Tom felt an overwhelming need to protect him, to uncover whatever had led him to this point. Over the next few days, Tom began digging into Ethan's past, starting with the records from child services. The files were sealed, as the nurse had mentioned, but Tom was no stranger to navigating the system. Using his contacts, he managed to get access to some of the files that were related to Ethan, though many details were still missing. He couldn't figure out how someone so young could have a past so secretive, and yet, the deeper he looked, the more he felt like he was stumbling into a rabbit hole. Tom's investigation led him to a small, obscure section of the records that mentioned Ethan's biological mother. There were few details, but the name was enough to stop him cold. The woman listed as Ethan's mother had been a known criminal, one who had been involved in various high-stakes criminal activities, including trafficking, organized crime, and possibly even black market dealings. Tom's mind raced as he processed this information. The idea that Ethan's mother had been involved in such dangerous activities didn't make sense. He couldn't reconcile the innocent, fragile baby in his arms with the idea of a criminal past. However, the more Tom delved into the records, the more he realized that the mystery surrounding Ethan's mother went far deeper. She wasn't just some nameless, faceless criminal. Her connections ran deep, and there were whispers of something far darker in the world that she had been a part of. It wasn't just about drugs, money, or power. It was about something much more insidious, something that could have put Ethan's life at risk. Tom had a sinking feeling that he wasn't just dealing with an abandoned baby. Ethan's mother had likely been a pawn in a much larger game, and Ethan himself might have been targeted for reasons far beyond the reach of child services or law enforcement. In the days that followed, Tom grew more determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. He reached out to his contacts in the police force, asking for any information they might have on Ethan's mother. But the response was always the same. There were no clear answers. The case files were sparse, and anything relating to her seemed to be locked behind a veil of secrecy. One night, Tom received a strange call at home. It was late, and the voice on the other end was distorted, as though someone was trying to hide their identity. "Officer Hayes, you're getting too close," the voice warned, its tone cold and menacing. "You don't want to uncover what's really going on with that baby. Trust me, you're better off letting things lie. Leave it alone, or things won't end well for you or the kid." The line went dead before Tom could respond. The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, and Tom's instincts told him that the people behind this weren't just criminals. They were dangerous, well-connected, and willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their secrets. The next morning, Tom was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. He couldn't let anyone, no matter how powerful, stand in his way. Ethan needed him, and Tom wasn't going to let fear or intimidation stop him from protecting the child who had already stolen his heart. The deeper he looked, the more twisted the story became. Ethan's past was a tangled web of lies, secrets, and hidden truths. There were still so many unanswered questions. Who were the people after him? Why had they gone to such extreme measures to hide his existence? And what role had Ethan's mother played in all of this? As Tom continued his investigation, One thing became clear: the answers were out there, waiting to be uncovered. But the more Tom learned, the more he realized that the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. And no matter what he uncovered, he would have to be ready for the consequences. Ethan's life had been shaped by forces far beyond his control, but Tom was determined to make sure that, from this moment on, Ethan would have the future he deserved. One free of secrets, free of darkness, and full of love. Whatever it took, Tom was going to protect Ethan, even if it meant facing the most dangerous enemies he had ever encountered. Unraveling the past. Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. He had grown accustomed to that gut instinct from years of working in law enforcement. The hairs on the back of his neck would stand up when something felt off, and right now, everything felt off. He had barely begun to scratch the surface of Ethan's past, but with each new discovery, the web of mystery around the child seemed to grow more complicated and more dangerous. After the strange phone call the night before, Tom knew that whoever was behind Ethan's case wasn't going to make it easy for him. Whoever had placed Ethan in that trash can had clearly gone to great lengths to cover their tracks, and the more Tom dug, the more it became evident that this wasn't a simple case of child abandonment. This was something much bigger, something sinister. Determined to continue his investigation, Tom enlisted the help of a trusted colleague, Detective Samantha Pierce. Samantha was one of the few people Tom could trust with sensitive matters like this. They had worked together on several cases in the past, and she had a sharp mind and an unshakable sense of loyalty. If there was anyone who could help him get to the bottom of Ethan's past, it was Samantha. One evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep in his crib at the hospital, Tom met Samantha in a small, quiet coffee shop, far away from the prying eyes of the department. He couldn't risk talking about Ethan's case in any public place, especially not with the suspicion growing around it. "I need your help," Tom began, sliding a folder across the table to Samantha. "I've been digging into Ethan's past. It's not just a case of an abandoned child. There's more going on here, and I need you to help me find out what." Samantha opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. She raised an eyebrow as she read the brief information that Tom had managed to gather. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice tinged with concern. "This is more than just a sad story of neglect. Whoever Ethan's mother was, she wasn't just some random person. She was part of something bigger, and it's not good." Tom nodded grimly. "I don't know who's behind this, but I think they're dangerous. The baby's mother, her name's Lydia, was involved with some very shady people. There's talk of organized crime, trafficking, and some kind of underground operation. But it doesn't make sense. How does a baby like Ethan end up in the middle of all this?" Samantha closed the folder with a soft thud and looked at Tom, her face serious. "I don't have all the answers yet, but I've been hearing some strange rumors. There's a group, very secretive, very powerful. They have connections everywhere, and I think they're tied to whatever happened with Ethan's mother. They're the ones making sure everything is covered up." Tom leaned in, his voice urgent. "Who are they? What do they want with Ethan?" Samantha hesitated, as though weighing whether she should share what she had learned. Finally, she spoke in a low whisper. "I think they're connected to something bigger than we realize. There's talk of a project, something that involves children like Ethan, children who have been experimented on. It sounds crazy, but I've heard enough to know that it's not just a rumor. There's some kind of underground facility, somewhere, where children like him are being used for experiments, genetic manipulation, genetic modification, and more." Tom's blood ran cold. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was beyond anything he had imagined. But why? What do they want with babies like Ethan? Samantha's face was pale as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the million-dollar question. I don't know all the details, but from what I've gathered, this group, whatever they are, has been experimenting with human genetics for years. They'd been looking for ways to create something better, stronger, smarter, more powerful They'd been trying to control human biology, trying to create superhumans. And I think Ethan, or whoever his real parents are, was part of that plan. Tom sat back in his chair, the weight of her words crashing over him. It felt like everything he had known, everything he had believed in, was being ripped apart. He had always thought of people as inherently good, even when faced with the worst in humanity. But now he was starting to see the darkness that could lurk in the corners of the world, hidden beneath layers of lies and deception. If that's true, then Ethan. Tom trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Samantha nodded solemnly. If he's really part of whatever this project is, then his life has been a nightmare before it even began. And the people responsible aren't going to let him go easily. Whoever they are, they have a vested interest in keeping him under their control. And if they find out that you've been looking into it, things could get dangerous. Tom's jaw clenched. He couldn't back down now. He had already made a promise to Ethan, and there was no way he was going to let the child be swept away by forces beyond his control. "I won't let them take him," Tom said firmly, his voice unwavering. "I won't let them control his future." Samantha studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'm with you, but you have to be careful. This isn't just some local gang or criminal operation. This is big, Tom. And you don't know how far these people will go to cover up their secrets." Tom stood up, determination in his eyes. "I don't care how big it is. I'm going to find out what happened to Ethan's mother, and I'm going to protect him, no matter what it takes." The next few weeks were a blur of late nights, phone calls, and secret meetings. Tom and Samantha worked tirelessly, uncovering more and more about the shadowy organization behind Ethan's mysterious past. They discovered that Lydia, Ethan's mother, had once been a part of this underground genetic experimentation project, but she had become disillusioned with the group and tried to escape. However, escaping was easier said than done. Lydia had tried to flee with Ethan, but the group had found her, and in a desperate attempt to keep their experiments from being exposed, they had abandoned the baby in the trash, hoping to erase all traces of their involvement in the project. It was clear now that Ethan was more than just a random victim of circumstance. He was a key piece in something much larger, something far more dangerous than Tom had ever imagined. But Tom wouldn't back down. He knew he had to protect Ethan, and he knew the stakes were higher than ever. As he stood in the hospital room, looking down at the baby he had come to love as his own, Tom made a vow to himself. He would fight for Ethan's future, and he wouldn't rest until he had uncovered the truth, no matter how dark it might be. The shadowy figures lurking in the background wouldn't know what hit them. Tom was prepared to take on whatever came his way, because he wasn't just fighting for a child anymore. He was fighting for a life, a future, and the truth that had been buried for far too long. The cost of truth. The darkness that hung over Tom's investigation was suffocating, but he couldn't stop now. Every lead he uncovered, every piece of the puzzle he put together, only revealed a greater depth of the conspiracy surrounding Ethan. The shadows of the past, once distant and hazy, were beginning to take shape, and Tom knew that the road ahead was going to be treacherous. But no matter how dangerous, he couldn't walk away. Ethan needed him, and he wouldn't let the boy suffer for secrets he couldn't control. Tom and Samantha worked tirelessly, digging into every possible lead. They visited shady warehouses on the outskirts of the city, tracking down anyone who might have known something about the clandestine group that had once had its hands on Ethan's mother. They followed up on every small detail they could find in the records, every suspicious note, every hint of corruption. Slowly but surely they pieced together fragments of a story that no one wanted told. But the more they uncovered, the more they realized how far-reaching this organization was. It wasn't just local. It spanned across multiple states and even countries, with connections that went deep into the highest levels of power. This wasn't some small-time operation. This was a global network of influence and control, operating in the shadows, manipulating genetics and human biology for their own twisted purposes. The people behind this were untouchable, at least that's what they thought. Samantha's instincts had been right. There was something far more insidious behind Ethan's birth than anyone had imagined. The project Ethan's mother had been part of wasn't just about creating superhumans. It was about controlling the very essence of humanity. They weren't just experimenting on the human body, they were altering it, using genetic manipulation to create a new breed of humans that could be molded, controlled, and used as tools for the group's own ends. The more Tom learned, the more he realized just how much of Ethan's past had been erased. This child was not just a victim. He was a product, a creation of this underground operation. And now, the people responsible for his existence were coming for him. Tom couldn't ignore the danger that loomed over Ethan any longer. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that this wasn't just about the child. It was about stopping a global conspiracy, one that threatened not only Ethan's life, but the lives of countless others. He had to act fast, before the people behind the project found out that Ethan had survived, and before they could take him back into their control. But every time Tom thought he was getting closer to the truth, another barrier appeared. The more he learned, the more he realized that the organization was always one step ahead of him. Someone somewhere was feeding them information about his every move. It was as if they had eyes everywhere, watching, waiting, and ready to strike if anyone threatened to expose them. One night, after a particularly grueling day of gathering intel, Tom sat alone in his apartment, staring at the stack of documents and photos spread out before him. Samantha had gone home to rest, but Tom couldn't sleep. His mind was racing with the realization that there was so much more to uncover, and with every piece of information he found, the stakes became higher. He was no longer just fighting to protect Ethan. He was fighting for something far greater, an entire network of corruption, power, and manipulation that could destroy everything Tom believed in. Suddenly, the phone rang, cutting through the silence of the room. Tom's heart skipped a beat as he glanced at the caller ID. It was Samantha. "Tom, you need to get to the hospital now," she said, her voice tense and urgent. Tom's stomach twisted. "What's happened?" "I don't know," she replied, sounding panicked. "But I think someone's been inside the hospital. They're looking for Ethan. I can't reach anyone. I think they've compromised the security system. You need to get there before they do." Tom's pulse quickened. He didn't hesitate. Grabbing his jacket and the most important files, he bolted out the door and into his car, speeding through the dark streets toward the hospital. His mind raced with the possibilities of who could be after Ethan. Were they the same people who had left him in the trash? Were they finally closing in? When Tom arrived at the hospital, the parking lot was eerily empty. The usual bustle of the night shift was nowhere to be seen. The building itself seemed quiet, almost too quiet. He rushed inside, pushing through the door with urgency, and immediately noticed the tension in the air. Nurses and staff were on edge, whispering among themselves, as though they were all aware of something terrible, but weren't willing to say it out loud. Tom approached the nurse's station and found a familiar face, one he'd seen many times in the hospital. "Where's Ethan?" he demanded, his voice low but firm. The nurse looked at him, wide-eyed, as though afraid to speak. I don't know," she stammered. "He was here just a few minutes ago." But then, the security cameras, someone hacked them. They disabled everything. I think someone took him." A chill ran through Tom. His worst fear had come true. The people behind Ethan's past had found him. They had taken the child, and now they would stop at nothing to silence him. And Tom too, if necessary. "Did you see anything?" Tom pressed, trying to stay calm, though his hands were shaking with anger and fear. The nurse swallowed hard. "I didn't see anyone, but there was a man. He was wearing a black hoodie, and he had this look, like he knew exactly what he was doing. He went straight to Ethan's room. When I tried to stop him, he just shoved me aside and walked out with the baby." Tom's fists clenched at his sides. "Where did he go?" "Through the back exit," the nurse replied. "The alley behind the building. That's the last I saw of him." Without wasting another second, Tom sprinted toward the back exit, knowing that every second counted. As he reached the alley, he glanced around, desperate to find any sign of Ethan. But the alley was empty. There were no cars, no footprints, nothing to indicate where they had gone. Tom cursed under his breath and pulled out his phone, dialing Samantha's number. She picked up immediately. "They'd got him," Tom said, his voice tight with frustration. "I know," Samantha replied, her voice grim. "I've been checking the surveillance footage. Whoever did this knew exactly how to cover their tracks. I think we've got someone on the inside. They've been feeding them information about everything we've been doing." Tom's heart sank. The situation was far worse than he had imagined. This wasn't just a race against time to save Ethan. It was a battle against an enemy that had infiltrated every layer of the investigation, every security measure. Whoever was behind this had access to everything. And Tom had no idea who he could trust anymore. "Get to the safe house," Samantha instructed, her voice firm. "We need to regroup, figure out our next move. And we need to keep moving, Tom. They're not just after Ethan. They're after both of us now. And they'll stop at nothing to get rid of us." Tom glanced back at the dark, empty alley. The cold reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. The people behind this were too powerful, too entrenched. But Tom couldn't back down. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. Ethan had been taken, but Tom was coming for him, and nothing, not even the shadows lurking in the deepest corners of the world, could stop him. The final confrontation. The darkened streets blurred as Tom sped down the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Samantha's words echoed in his mind. "They're after both of us now. And they'll stop at nothing to get rid of us." The thought gnawed at him, but he refused to let fear rule him. Ethan needed him. The child had already been through too much, and Tom couldn't allow this shadowy organization to claim him again. As Tom pulled into the hidden safe house, a small, nondescript building tucked away on a quiet street, he noticed that the lights were already on. Samantha was waiting inside, a grim expression on her face as she paced back and forth, clearly tense. "Any new leads?" Tom asked, stepping inside. Samantha nodded and motioned for him to sit. "I've been going through the footage we managed to pull before the security systems were completely taken down. We've got something. It's not much, but it's a start." Tom sat down, his heart pounding in anticipation. The puzzle pieces were scattered everywhere, and he needed to know what connected them. He needed to find Ethan. "We've got a name," Samantha continued. "A man named Adrian Blackwell. He's the one who took Ethan. From what I could gather, he's a former operative for the organization, the one responsible for the project. But he's been operating independently for a while now. I think he's going rogue, Tom. He's got his own agenda." Tom's breath caught. "What do you mean going rogue? Why would he take Ethan?" Samantha looked at him, her eyes dark with concern. "I think he wants to control Ethan, or rather, control what Ethan represents. He's seen the potential in the project, maybe even more so than the group that originally started it. If Ethan is as valuable as we think, then Blackwell might be trying to build an army. An army of genetically enhanced children, all under his control." Tom's gut twisted. "And if we let him get away with it?" "Not if." Samantha cut him off, her voice steel. "When? If we don't act fast, he'll be untouchable. We need to find him, Tom, and we need to do it now." The clock was ticking, and with every passing second, the situation grew more dire. Tom knew that if Blackwell was allowed to take Ethan, it wouldn't just be the end of the boy's future. It would be the end of everything they were fighting for. A future controlled by the whims of men like Blackwell, men who thought they could shape humanity to their will, tampering with the most sacred thing of all, life itself. Samantha handed Tom a map of the city, marking several locations with a red pen. "I've tracked Blackwell's movements. I believe he's holed up in an old facility just outside of the city, about 30 miles away. It's isolated, remote, and it's got a network of underground tunnels. Perfect place for him to hide. Tom studied the map. The facility was hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by layers of security. It looked like an old industrial building, abandoned for years, and yet it was still operational, connected to the underground network that Blackwell seemed to control. "I'm going in," Tom said decisively. "We can't afford to waste time. We'll leave immediately." Samantha grabbed her gear and slung a bag over her shoulder. "I'm coming with you." Tom shot her a worried glance. "It's dangerous, Sam. If Blackwell's really got control of this place, it's going to be a war zone. You don't have to come with me." Samantha squared her shoulders, her expression unwavering. "If I've learned anything in this investigation, it's that we're in this together. Besides, I'm not going to sit on the sidelines while you risk your life. We do this as a team, or we don't do it at all." Tom hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. He knew she was right. He wasn't alone in this fight. Together, they left the safe house and made their way to the old facility, their hearts heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. As they drove through the darkened streets, the world outside seemed to fade into the background, and only the looming figure of Blackwell's hideout remained in their minds. The journey felt endless. The closer they got, the more the tension in the air seemed to mount. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every passing car a potential enemy. But neither of them spoke a word. They both knew what was at stake. They didn't need to say anything. They were both prepared for whatever they had to face. When they finally reached the facility, it was even more imposing than Tom had imagined. The building loomed out of the darkness, its broken windows reflecting the pale light of the moon. There was an eerie stillness to the place, as if it were waiting for them to make their move. Tom and Samantha approached cautiously, their footsteps barely making a sound against the cracked pavement. Tom's mind raced as they neared the entrance. They had to get in, find Ethan, and get out before Blackwell knew they were there. But Tom wasn't sure how they would ever manage it. The facility was a fortress, and Blackwell was no amateur. They reached the side of the building, where a small rusted door provided their only means of entry. Tom placed his ear against it, listening for any sign of movement. Hearing nothing, he motioned for Samantha to follow, and they slipped inside, the door creaking quietly as they entered. Inside was cold, damp, and dark. The walls were lined with old equipment, long abandoned and left to gather dust. But the air felt different here, charged with something dark, something that made Tom's skin crawl. They moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows, until they reached a hallway that led deeper into the facility. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, but Tom wasn't worried. He had a feeling that Blackwell's men were far too occupied with their own twisted plans to notice two intruders creeping through the darkness. As they advanced, the sound of voices reached them, low, muffled, coming from somewhere ahead. Tom exchanged a look with Samantha, then motioned for her to stay close. The closer they got, the more they could hear. It was clear that Blackwell wasn't alone. There were others, men and women, working for him, just as dangerous and driven by the same dark goals. Suddenly, the hallway opened into a large chamber, and there, in the center, stood Blackwell. He was pacing back and forth, a sinister grin on his face. Behind him was a large steel door, reinforced with heavy locks. Tom's heart raced as he realized what was behind that door. Ethan. But before Tom could make a move, Blackwell turned, his sharp eyes locking onto them. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, his voice cold and amused. "Did you really think you could stop me?" The confrontation had begun. Tom's breath quickened, and in that moment, he knew that everything had led to this. Ethan's life, his own, and the lives of countless others hung in the balance. This would be the final battle, the one that would determine the fate of them all. Tom stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "You'll never control him. Not if I have anything to say about it." Blackwell's grin widened. "You're too late, officer. The future is already here, and I always get what I want." With a single signal, his men surged forward, surrounding Tom and Samantha. But they were ready. This wasn't the end. Not yet.